Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today we take a look at a very iconic French sword from the 19th century, perhaps one of the most iconic, and perhaps one of the most iconic swords of the 19th century period. And it has to be said, not only of the 19th century, because the service life of this sword actually stretches to today. Some units in the French army still have this as their standard dress or uniform, as their official uniform, although obviously I assume it's not anymore meant for combat, but more for formality. This is, some of you may recognize it as the 1845 Infantry Officer Sabre, but this one specifically is the 1855 variation. The two are virtually identical. The only differences you will find are in the scabbard, which we will not be able to see because unfortunately I don't have the scabbard for this sword, and in the blade, which in the 1855 version was made a little narrower than it used to be in its older brother. That being said, there are a few official variations of this sword. You will find this was meant for all kinds of officers in the French army, infantry officers, and there's a distinction between the sword for superior officers, so upper rank, and in that case they will have a straight blade, which tapers into a spear tip, and with some deep fullers that run all along the length of the blade. This, which you see here instead, is the model for NCOs or junior officers. In French, you would call them Adjudant. It's the Adjudant model of the Infantry Sabre. And it's characterized by a rather not too pronounced curve, so it's slightly curved over here. And then it has a very interesting fuller configuration, which we're going to look at in detail in just a moment. So this sword saw combat from 1845 through some rather intense wars. We're talking about, for example, the Franco-Prussian War, but it also saw use in World War I, because even though the French army decided at some point to update its gear and create new swords for their troops, these were usually deemed way too fragile. This sword has a rather stout and heavy-duty blade, and I can definitely understand why soldiers during World War I would have gone for a better performing blade in actual terms of the blows and resilience of the sword itself, rather than a perhaps more precisely designed, maybe, but more fragile weapon. It has to be said that the reason why these were built so stout and heavy-duty also has to do, as far as I was able to read, but unfortunately I don't have a source for that because I don't remember where I read it, but in the economy of the French army, swords were meant to last 50 years. So to be able to last that long in a time when they were used in conflict, they obviously needed to have quite sturdy blades, because these would eventually be passed over the decades from one officer to the next, and they needed to be able to withstand time, conflict, and different people using them. So, a very interesting sword, and with all of this out of the way, let's look at its details. Okay, so let's take a look at this sword. Let's start from the hilt, and the most characteristic thing that you'll often notice in versions of these swords are that it has this beautiful open work on the right side of the guard, and then it has this upturned lip on the left side. I imagine this was for comfort of the wearer, so that this wouldn't kind of bite into your side. We have this upturned quillin with some remains of gilding in the case of this specific sword. And actually it's very lovely. The nice thing is of the open work, of course, it's that it's decorated even on the outside of, well, what would be the underside of the hilt too. So it's quite an elaborate sword. We have this horn grip, slightly damaged in this case, but not to an excessive extent. And it's wrapped in wire, simple wire binding. This one is still, well, technically intact, but it's loose on a few of the top circles, as you see here. We then have this pommel area here with some lovely decorations. Again, you can see how detailed the piercing, for example, on the flower here is something that always surprises me in how detailed it is. Or the little lines drawn on the leaves. You can actually see like the blades drawn on the leaf. The blade is peened through, so you see it coming out of the pommel at the end here. And if we look at the knuckle guard, we see it has this open section here with these two branches of the knuckle guard that then kind of unite. And what also strikes me of the knuckle guard is that it's not just a one bar of brass, but it's designed to almost mimic a three, you can see 1, 2, 3 elements combining. That is a little touch of, I think, aesthetic beauty. And the knuckle guard then develops here. This branch goes out to circle around the openwork decoration. Now, looking at the blade. This blade is rather unusual because if you see its color, it's deep black, which when I received this sword, it was a gift. For a moment, I thought, well, this must be a fake because I've never seen a shiny black blade like this. I tried asking around, and some information I got, it was all very speculative, of course, so there's nothing I can say for certain. But some speculation was that in World War I, or around the times of World War I, one method to preserve blades and protect them was to douse them in kerosene or petrol or some other flammable liquid, and then set it on fire. And either the residue of this flammable material or the burning itself caused this black sheen over the blade. I'm not 100% sure that's the case. It feels way too, like the blade is actually smooth and clean. It doesn't feel like there's any deposit on it, so I really don't know what to say about it. However, if we look at the markings, we can see it has all the markings you would expect from this kind of sword. So you have there the Manufacture Impériale de Châtellerault, and then you have a date. I think that's June 1856. And then you have Officier d'Infanterie, Model 1855. So this is a rather early version of the 1855. It would be within the first year, I guess, or first year and a half of production of this sword. Looking at other markings, we have the remains here of what would be the typical approval marks. We have, let me see if I can give you a better view of them. There we go, if I can get them in focus. We have what could be an M there, and what could be a B, as far as I can tell. And those marks are actually repeated. We see them here on the hilt as well, on the knuckle guard. So we have, I'm sorry, this was a little tough to focus, but yes, we have a B, you'll see here, under a star. This seems to be like a number, so it might be a 90 or a 36 or a 90, I think it's a 36 though. And then here we have an M, again, under what seems like a crown. So the marks seem to be consistent. Now, moving to the blade configuration, which I mentioned was very interesting, you have this fuller that starts almost at the ricasso, and there isn't really a ricasso in terms of like a big separation between the ricasso and the beginning of the blade. This fuller just kind of starts right from the start, it slides in, and you have this wide fuller that runs all the way through the blade. But what you'll see here is that about a quarter up the blade, you get this deep but very narrow fuller developing, and you can see how deep it is because you can see the ridge really well. And this fuller continues alongside the main fuller, but slowly starts getting wider, so we can actually see towards the third quarter of the blade, this fuller gets wider, this top one. and then actually tapers out, and what's left is only the ridge. And the ridge takes over the first fuller we saw and moves down towards the center of the blade until the two fullers now are separated by what is essentially a central ridge in the blade. So I hope that made sense, but we'll just look at it once more really quickly. You have the main fuller here. It's soon joined by this narrow fuller up here, and they run together all along the blade until this central ridge slowly takes over and moves down in the blade until it's actually a central ridge that meets up here at the spear tip of the blade. So this was the 1855 Infantry Officer Adjudant Sabre. It's a sword that you can find relatively easily in auctions and marketplace, like antique marketplaces and stores. So if you have the opportunity to pick one up for a price that fits your budget, I would absolutely recommend you do, because it's a great piece of history and a very unique blade and a very nice object to have. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon with another sword video, and thank you for watching.